Guys, I'm gonna get started. Thank you everybody for joining us. I'm gonna go to like 2 or 3 slides, and then I apologize for pauses when I'm letting more people in as they show up here. So give me 1 second just to share my screen. All right. All right. So some of you guys were actually here last week for the PEDS panel, and so in an effort to avoid repetition, we'll stay away from some of that information about the program. And so we had given you some background about like our values and tenets, and we'll just kind of go quickly through that and then focus specifically on EMS today. For people who were not here last week, you can always find that information on the website as well. So thank you guys for joining us for our second fall virtual panel series, where we're talking about EMS, disaster medicine, and COVID. The residents said we should have renamed this like the Fem-EM or the Girl Power panel as well, since it's dominated by our strong women. So we got Jess, Sinnott, Liz, Regan, and Jenna, who will introduce themselves shortly to us. For you guys who were here last week, you saw this slide already, but this is our mission statement. And just for 1 second, we'll go through, which is basically the core beliefs or kind of guiding principles from the program is that our goals are always to train awesome experts, emergency physicians. We believe at their core, being an awesome clinician is what will get you or will best prepare you for whatever the future may hold for you, whether that's community, academics, fellowship, whatever it may be. We are in a very busy and very acute environment, and so we value the importance of balance and wellness during training. It's 3 tough years, but it doesn't have to be 3 damaging or terrible years, especially if you do things correctly. And so we value wellness. We focus on individual career preparation, and we can probably talk specifically about that for EMS a little bit today. And we value diversity and inclusion. And so we will not go through those at as much detail as we maybe did last week. Instead, we're going to just pivot straight to the EMS information. This is a picture from one of our EMS field trips 2 years ago now. I just don't report them. I don't think we had any business being on top of that truck, but we got on top of it. And so we're here with Jess, Sinnott, Liz, Regan, and Jenna Jurkovic, and I'm going to have you guys just introduce yourselves. Maybe just tell us like a little bit about your background, where you're from, and how you got to Christ. Jess, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I'm from the Chicago suburbs. I went to med school at Rush, and then I actually trained at Christ. I graduated in 2012, and then I went and worked in the community for 8 years. Did some EMS stuff there, and then came back in January and started as the EMS medical director here.
Liz, how about you go next?
Very similar to Jess. I grew up in the Chicagoland area. I went to Rush for med school. I did not know Jess at the time. Did my residency at Christ, and then stayed on as an attending and kind of created this new disaster preparedness role, which is very common on the East and West Coast to have a physician kind of be a medical director for disaster medicine and preparedness and all of the policies and preparations that kind of go around that. And so I kind of created that role here. And then I also serve as one of the other assistant EMS medical directors as well.
And Jenna?
Yeah, so I'm Jenna Jurkovic. So I'm also from the area as well. Common theme, went to Midwestern University for medical school and also did residency at Christ. I just finished this past year and was fortunate enough to be able to stay on as an attending and also as an assistant EMS medical director. I did not have a lot of background experience in EMS, but was really fortunate to kind of fall into that role because one became available. I was fortunate enough to work alongside Liz a lot throughout residency with disaster preparedness, but then most notably last year with the COVID response, which we'll get into a little bit more later, and just have been really happy and fortunate to be able to stay on not only as an attending, but also in this EMS and assistant disaster role as well.
So last week, the whole panel was from the East Coast. So this week, everybody's local. That might be good if we have to go into a breakdown of neighborhoods or anything. And so the bottom part of this slide comments a little bit about kind of the core curriculum for our residents, which is that regardless of maybe their level of interest in EMS, everybody does complete the EMS admin rotation, which is 1 full month, and about half of that is devoted specifically to EMS opportunities and learning. There's basically a longitudinal didactic curriculum, which is true of most kind of topics at Christ. We stick with longitudinal curriculums. And so that means lectures at conference, field trips, and in terms of disaster stuff, we've done active shooter drills and a bunch of simulations recently. And so that will come throughout your residency all 3 years. We've got an associated EMS academy, which is not far, and actually occasionally we'll do conference there because they give us their space, which is nice. And then we're the online medical control for about 12,000 ambulance runs yearly, maybe more or less this year. Who knows with COVID anymore? So I took a couple of clips here. This is from our recent disaster preparedness drill. I say recent. This was it 2018 now? October?
Yeah, 2 years ago.
It feels recent, but that time flies when you're in a pandemic. And so this was Liz grant funded, I believe, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So this was grant funding that Liz got to do basically the largest disaster drill in the history of the state of Illinois. I think it was 500 EMS, like pre-arrival people helping out. I think 6 municipalities were participating in the drill. An additional 500 Christ staffers, doctors, nurses, techs. And it was an explosion at one of the local train stations that ultimately led to, that was the kind of the core of the drill. So really cool opportunity. And for people like Jenna who are residents, part of the way that they got involved during their training. This slide is purposely blank because it's not over, right? It's ever evolving. And so I was asking Liz for some specific numbers, but we were the busiest COVID center in the state of Illinois, which is saying something because we had quite a first peak in Illinois. When we were at the top of that peak, we had about 260 patients admitted to the hospital. So it's the volume of a lot of hospitals in this country. And Liz was saying we've seen a little over 2,000 patients so far, admitted. Who knows how many thousands of others were discharged home with COVID. And so seeing a whole lot of COVID during that period and a whole lot of adjustment as a result. And then we throw a couple of quick shots up here from the EMS field trips, because this is basically every resident's favorite part of training is the EMS trip every year. We rotate through the topics so you get to experience them all. It's extrication. What's the one we did last?
Search and rescue and hazmat.
Hazmat was last week. Thank you. It could be search and rescue as well. So those are super fun. The residents love the jaws of life where they get to break down cars and stuff. Any opportunity to break windows. Playing with saws and steal other people's outfits. Mm-hmm. There's also a lot of great learning as well. That's actually the picture from hazmat, which was just last week. So a great opportunity as well. And that kind of wraps up my slides, and we'll pivot to just let me let a couple more people. We'll pivot to the question and answer portion of this. Some of you guys, again, sent me questions before, which we'll start with. And then you can, I know some of you guys preferred to send private messages last time to me. You can share it with the group. No such thing as a bad question. We're happy to answer all of them. And I'm going to start. I'll open it up. And so there's a question about, for people like yourselves who are maybe a little bit more interested in EMS, what sort of opportunities exist outside of the standard rotation to help either kind of foster that interest or build a resume for the future? Any of you can take that. Liz, you probably got a good answer to start.
I was actually going to pivot to Jess, but
yeah.
Go ahead,
I'll let Jess answer that one, and I'll piggyback onto it.
So there's certainly an opportunity to do an additional elective that can kind of be what you're interested in doing. So we've had other additional ride-along opportunities within our system, some opportunities to do research. Certainly more involvement in the national organizations and things like that to kind of help. And it kind of depends on what you're interested in doing too. And so we can certainly tailor things to that.
I'll give a little bit more specifics just from a residency leadership standpoint, which is we talked last week for some of the people who are more interested in PEDS. Part of the beauty of having the built-in elective blocks is that the residents are free to use them for whatever they're interested in or whatever they think will best suit them in the future. And so we've had residents kind of do additional EMS blocks. Disaster medicine blocks. Most recently, Liz, I don't know if we were calling these pandemic or COVID blocks where they're helping out with sort of the incident command. That was a very cool and unique opportunity, I think, for a lot of our residents. So that stuff can help foray into career future resume stuff. And then Jess and I are currently working with Kevin Smith, one of our residents who was a paramedic before he went to med school. On, every resident has to complete a scholarly project or research study, however you want to define that. And so we're looking at EMS calls during that COVID period and kind of changes or trends during that time. So there's ways kind of to foray that into your resume.
Yeah, I mean, speaking as someone who did a lot of EMS or disaster elective time when I was a resident, it's kind of you can go into every facet, whatever you wanted. So we have had EMS electives, we've had disaster medicine electives. If it's around the time that we're doing a big drill, I usually bring the residents in with me if there's someone interested in doing an elective to kind of come with me and see behind the scenes planning, and they get to make a lot of connections with me. I do a lot of speaking and coordination with local law enforcement, local EMS, but also our local FEMA, National Guard, FBI, things like that. And I'll bring residents with me to kind of get involved and get their foot in the door with that. And in addition to EMS opportunities, we've had residents do EMS electives where they do more ride-along time. They try and get more knowledgeable about our EMS systems, specifically in our region. And then we get them involved with QI projects if they're interested with that, teaching in our EMS classes if they're interested with that, or a little bit of both. This year, I think we're probably going to send, if they still have the course in January, a couple residents to the EMS medical director's course that are interested in EMS and kind of taking the next step at possibly getting a certification as an EMS medical director that they can have on their resume for when they're applying for their, long-term positions. So, we try and do as much as we can to kind of get as much EMS experience to those that are interested and provide those next steps for them.
Yeah, I can kind of add to that as someone who just recently went through it as a resident and now have found myself in this role. I was fortunate enough that Christ supported me so much throughout residency to be able to transition into this. So I was actually able to go to the medical director course in January with Jess, which was phenomenal and which really helped to prepare me in this role. And then my elective time was spent with Liz on the COVID response team as part of the strike team as the COVID response as well. So I feel like I was able to do more as a resident in this role that I had ever imagined, and it certainly has prepared me for my job in this role as an attending as well. And I had nothing but support from the residency leadership team as well as Liz and Jess during that time. So it's just nice to be in that environment where you're supported to, to do a little bit more outside of just emergency medicine and transition into your career and kind of find your niche. The other thing that's nice as well that they mentioned with the teaching aspect at the academy, Christ is affiliated with the EMT and paramedic course. And so if medical education is something that you're interested as well, on top of EMS, you have the opportunity to run like simulation labs with the paramedic and EMT students and teach lectures to them and just do different types of like hands-on learning. And then it's nice to see them rotating in the emergency department as well, because you get this kind of longitudinal experience with them where you're going into their environment, you're teaching them, they're really happy to have you, and you're happy to partner along with them as well. And then they come into the department and you're able to take care of patients together when they're on the rotation, which is a really nice and unique experience.
Mm-hmm.
One of our current residents who's also interested in EMS is going to be spending part of his elective time doing like creating and then running a simulation with our upcoming paramedic class. So it just kind of depends on what you're interested in. If you're interested in research, we can help facilitate that. If you're more interested in education or developing and delivering education, there's that option as well.
It's like one of the common themes on these panels is there's so much overlap between, whether it's education, EMS, research, ultrasound, simulation, like these things all kind of overlap with one another. And so the nice thing is, even if your interest is in one of those fields, like there's ways to make that work in different areas, I guess. Jess or Jenna, I'm going to pivot to you guys. One of the med students wisely asked this question, which is that we are one of the few Chicago programs. Our address is actually outside Chicago, right? So we're a couple of blocks outside the city. And I think that makes for a really unique experience in terms of like the ambulances that show up to our bay are from Chicago or from Oak Lawn or from a lot of places. Can one of you guys just comment, like how many towns are we drawing from Because it feels like a lot, or states maybe. Like, how big is our region?
So it's hard to answer that question. So we get transfers from kind of all over because we're a trauma center. So we'll get transfers from Indiana and other places. Like we get people from our region, ambulances from our region. I don't know if I could think of a number, Liz. I don't know a number. Do you know off the top of your head, like how many different?
Give us a guess. Like, how many towns are coming?
I'd say on the regular, there's probably like, I don't know, 15 maybe.
Okay.
I'd say in our immediate system, there's around 15 in our region, which is kind of a larger geographical area that share the same protocols that we do, but
we don't get all their patients.
Yeah. But I mean, the providers that we see could be coming from upwards of 30 different municipalities and private ambulance companies, with a few being out of state. And then obviously we take air traffic EMS too. If there's a bad accident or something, or somebody needs to be flown to us, we do take those as well.
And obviously that amount of municipalities provides a unique challenge when contact tracing during a pandemic, but we'll skip that for now. I think the plus side is, like, when you talk about diverse patient population, people talk about Chicago being a city of neighborhoods, or the Chicagoland area, and that's incredibly true, and both a very positive and very negative thing. But kind of, if you look on a map and just type in the programs in Chicago, you'll see this huge gap between like the downtown area and then us. And so the result is we draw from a very diverse patient population. And I feel like the EMS system is like a perfect example of that. There's a lot of COVID questions. Liz, this could be its own panel, but they were asking about kind of the changes and adjustments within Christ to adapt to the COVID pandemic. And so, how do you adjust to being the busiest COVID center in Illinois during a global pandemic?
You put a lot of physicians on your incident management team, number one. No, so we, for those of you that are not familiar, there's a normal disaster scheme and setup for hospitals. It's called Hospital Incident Command, or the Hospital Incident Command System through FEMA. And it's kind of very well organized. You've got one person running the incident, and then you've got, different facets, operations, logistics, planning, blah, blah, blah. And you've got people that you can normally target to put into those roles. So that was something. We have a very robust emergency preparedness response at Christ. So we kind of already knew people that could fit into those roles and specialties. So luckily, we had administration that was very willing to get on this quickly. We actually stood up our incident command and started planning about 2 weeks before the rest of Advocate Aurora and the rest of the Chicago hospitals did. And that's how we were able to transition so quickly. We knew that we were going to probably have to have a COVID unit. And it was funny, when we started, we knew that it was possible COVID was going to come to the Chicagoland area. And we kind of mapped out 10 negative pressure rooms in our, 780 bed hospital that could house COVID patients. And, 1 week into it, we realized all of our beds were full. So we then pivoted to the fact that we're probably going to need a COVID medical unit and an ICU dedicated for COVID. And so we switched gears and like any gold standard in a pandemic, realized that we needed to cohort these patients together and keep them away from healthy patients. And so then it just became a gradual thing of, we stood up the first COVID unit. We learned what we needed to in terms of staffing and airflow and PPE, and what every patient was expected to go through in terms of PPE, how to limit providers, right? How to run vent screens outside of, an ICU room, so you didn't have to go in and out, in and out. And we kind of had these, an initial medical unit and an initial ICU. And after that, and those got full probably within the first week, it just became this gradual process that was well learned by that time of how to open up a COVID unit. And at our peak, we had 10 COVID units. So, and like you were saying, that housed about 260 COVID positive and PUI patients that were pretty high risk for COVID. And so it was kind of a gradual process. We had a group together that decided, okay, how best are we going to cohort these patients, what units are the best in the hospital in terms of not sharing airflow with other units, what could be an isolated, who's going to be taking care of them, what PPE do they need, how do we get that to them, how do we try to limit all of the changes that COVID had with PPE and the learning. How do we limit that to a group of providers that could become experts in it as opposed to spreading it throughout the entire hospital? And then really it just snowballed from there. It was like every day, do we need to open up another unit? Yes or no. And sometimes we were making that decision, on a 12-hour window. So that's kind of how we did it. And then gradually we came down, and I mean gradually. So from April 5th, that's when we hit 200 patients, to mid-June, we were still at 200 patients. So it took us a long time to come down under 200. And then after that was just a gradual pullback. Okay, how can we reduce COVID units? Right now we're operating with 3. So we've not been able to really go down past that. Our census is around 60. The lowest we've been is about mid-30s, and we've not gone any lower than that. And that was just last week. And then we kind of ballooned back up to 60s today and yesterday. So it was really just, we kind of trialed it when our volume was really, really low. And then we kind of worked out the kinks, and then we just expanded from there. So.
Somebody asked a specific of how this affected residents uniquely, on more of a micro level. That's another kind of multifaceted question. So, this all, we saw COVID coming, and then it kind of blew up pretty quick, and it was fascinating to see kind of it evolve. When this first started, all of the tests were being run through the state of Illinois, and the turnaround time was like 7 days, if I remember correctly. And so, advocate purchasing, more rapid testing, and now we're doing our testing through a variety of labs and stuff. So that has changed a whole lot. But when this all started across the country, volumes kind of collapsed, and our ED stayed busier than most EDs in this country just because we have a very underserved population, but even that was slower. And so I think the biggest effects on residents, aside from like becoming professional PPE and just very skilled in that art, I think, is we ACGME, and I'm forgetting the terminology, we called it DEFCON 5, where basically they said, for one of these very rare instances, you can start pulling your residents off of other rotations if need be to help deal with this pandemic. In states like Illinois and New York, they actually, the governor signed bills saying that the residents could practice entirely independently without attending signing charts. And so when things first got crazy, we had some residents who volunteered as moonlighting shifts to go work in our triage area. And there was that initial, it was a lot, Liz, like a classic like mass casualty incident where you had like the walking wounded who come first and you have to kind of turn them away. It felt like initially we had our walking wounded, a very well appearing 20 to 30 plus 20-year-old, 30-year-old patients who likely had COVID, but we had, nobody had testing at the time, and they couldn't stay. And so a lot of our residents kind of were down in the triage bay doing that. And then in some of the areas that could spare it, like ortho or peds or whatever, we pulled some of those residents either to the emergency department or people like Jenna, who spent some time on the strike team. And so one caveat, somebody had asked, when we refer to PUI, what we mean is person under investigation. That's what Liz is referring to there. And so early on in the pandemic, everybody was a PUI because we had very little access to testing. Nobody had testing. And so now we have rapid testing, and it's a lot easier to actually confirm their status. But you guys are also talking about like strike team a little bit. Jenna, could you maybe just tell a little bit about like what the strike team is, what it does, and that's a unique thing because it doesn't exist in a regular period in history.
Yeah, absolutely. We're really fortunate to have that. So it's a COVID strike team or COVID response team. And essentially the entire job is to just manage the COVID response, as you would suggest. Liz is the one that put all of that together, but I was part of helping her as one of the main residents on the team. And essentially what we do is just track every COVID possible patient that comes through the hospital. And it's a lot of operational aspects behind COVID as well. But, essentially there's always a physician and a nurse that's part of this team. And it has kind of evolved. Early on, when the strike team was pretty much just Liz and I, we were going to do the COVID swabs and we were contacting IDPH and we were tracing everything individually. But then when the response became as large as it is, then we pulled in a lot of other people to help us. And so there is an app that has been made where we pretty much enter all of the patients that are tested into the app to kind of do contact tracing throughout the hospital. So you add in different demographics about their past medical history, their oxygen requirements, whether or not they ever needed to be admitted to an ICU level of care. We have close communication then with the bed board system of the hospital to make sure that these patients are appropriately placed in COVID units as opposed to non-COVID units. Keep track of their movement throughout the hospital, their isolation status, things of that nature. So it's just the overarching response team of the COVID strike, or of the COVID response in the hospital. We field a lot of calls from everyone in the hospital that maybe they're concerned now that their patient has newly become symptomatic, or all these questions that they were previously tested positive. Now what should we do? And so there's a lot that goes into it, but it's definitely a necessary team to have in order to run this. And it is run 24/7. So there's always someone available, and they're housed in the hospital in a separate area, and like a conference center essentially, to always be available to answer any questions and to trace all the efforts throughout the hospital.
The you three on this panel are obviously doing a lion's share of those strike shifts, or had done a bunch. I do them once in a blue moon. I took sign out from Jess last time. And I think one of the things that became very clear when working these is that, in emergency medicine, we talk about any patient, anywhere, anytime. And I think EM physicians are uniquely qualified to run a strike team or a COVID incident command, because it takes kind of a broad scope of knowledge to be able to interface with the gynecologists and the intensivists and the transferring doctors to figure out like who goes where and what our level of concern is. And so, you train for emergency medicine thinking with an idea of what your future is going to look like, and then a pandemic happens, and it just, it goes to show if you train in the right environments with a diverse patient population, you really are kind of prepared for anything, I think.
Yeah, and I was our incident commander from like March 1st to June 1st, and then largely was the day-to-day operations person until October 1st with COVID. And ER physicians are uniquely set up to handle something like that, because we don't get into the weeds. I don't care what somebody's dimer is trending today, and whether or not they can be downgraded. I just need to know how many patients do we have and where do we put them, and do we have enough PPE or testing supplies. It was uniquely positioned, and it's fun and interesting to be able to tell these very I don't want to phrase this nicely, administrators and like other heads of department to just stop talking about the details and get to the focus, and really try to help guide them through how to manage a big incident. And you can think about it as essentially what we were doing was having like a mass casualty event every day for 3 months. So constantly reevaluating where the resources were going. Did we have enough vents? Did we have enough? Actually, the thing we ran the shortest on at times was disinfecting wipes and IV pumps and pulse oxes. And that was something that we had to troubleshoot. And how do we get that? How do we create a tele or an ICU room out of a normal medical bed, right? How do we do those things? How do we transform a PACU into an ICU or things like that, or create extra space? We don't have the luxury of setting a tent out, in nice 75-degree weather in Chicago. We can't do that. So how do we expand? How do we create more ICU beds or tele beds within the constraints that we have? And it really takes kind of a big picture person to do that. And I think EM is a specialty that kind of lends itself well to that.
And I think also being resourceful and like MacGyverish, right? And figuring out, how to solve a problem. That's what we do in EM, right? We're problem solvers. And I think that also kind of problem solvers in a rapid way, you know? So I think that, again, uniquely makes us a good fit for this
Right.
clinic.
And
So.
if we make the wrong decision, we pivot in the day, in the next day. Right. We don't get hung up on the fact that that initial decisive decision might not have been the best or is not working out long term. So that's also like a key characteristic that you need at the helm.
Yeah.
Move on and get ready for your next wrong decision. We had talked, Dave Baronis gave a lecture to our residents, kind of a, it's hard to do a look back at COVID when we're still in the middle of it and cases are rising, but doing a brief look back at that couple month stretch. And he was talking about how one of the blessings of being in a enormous healthcare system, Advocate Aurora Health, is that, he said while other hospitals were turning patients away from their ICUs, being able to say, okay, we'll take your patient from Good Shepherd down here, and we'll take that patient, move them up to Masonic. Patients between Illinois and Wisconsin was extremely unique. I'll tell you, practicing down in the ED when shit was starting to hit the fan, one of the things that was really reassuring for me was that we never felt like we had a huge PPE crunch. And one of the people had asked, how did that go, particularly for residents? And that's a legitimate concern. But how did we avoid the PPE chaos that other places did?
Planning.
Did we
have an ED doc at the helm? No.
Did something fall off a truck, or how did we not run out of masks?
You had a robust emergency preparedness department in the hospital that had their own stockpile that we didn't necessarily share with Advocate Aurora.
And Liz, go ahead and just take a bow there.
You know the manufacturers of all the supply companies by first name and call in favors.
Yeah. And I guess purchasing power too, right? It's the bigger the system, the larger the order. You probably get first dibs on some of this stuff, which is nice.
Yeah, no, our PPE, we had a couple close scares, but I think it helped that we were very, very accurate with what our need was on campus. And that was right at the beginning of when COVID started. We actually calculated, we saw people going in and out of rooms, whether it was an ICU patient or a medical patient. And we actually calculated a PPE burn rate. So we were actually able to forecast what we would need based on how many patients that we had and what other ancillary services that we had going, right? For a long period of time, all of our surgeries had come to a halt. But when we started to bring them back, we needed to know how much PPE we needed for them, our normal amount, plus the additional COVID patients. So we had a good idea of what our PPE burn rate was. And then it was just realizing and anticipating that, hey, there's a national shortage. We're going to hit a shortage at one point, and just kind of exhausting all options at the very beginning to get as much extra PPE that we needed. And then once we kind of had a little bit of a lull, and for us that was under 200 patients, looking to kind of recoup some of our supplies, which is what we've done. So we're in a good spot too moving forward.
I'm going to pivot just slightly. I'm trying to get through all these private questions you guys have, so feel free to keep them coming. We've got about 10 more minutes, so there's more to it. But one of the students said that it's unique to see 3 women running a panel in a field like EMS, which is typically male dominated. And they wanted to know if you guys could just comment on the mentorship you received at Christ, particularly as a woman in medicine.
I think there is definitely a environment of female leadership there that kind of encouraged that. And when I came back, that was part of the reason I came back too, is because there's an environment of support there and just encouragement, hey, we want you to come have a position of leadership here, and we're going to support that. So I guess that's been my feeling.
I'll give specifics. When you say there's an environment of women in leadership, because these people, a lot of our viewers here probably have no idea, but so our program director, Elise Lovell, is obviously a woman. Our vice chair is Mila Felder. Kelly Guglielmi is the CMO of the hospital. And so basically all the power players are women. And I think that, when it comes down to it, it's one thing to be supportive. It's another thing to actually have women in leadership positions, including 3 people on this panel,
Yeah, I think it was just so EMS is mostly a male-dominated subgroup. And I would say actually to be a woman in EMS is probably, considered diverse. We don't necessarily think that way. And actually Chicago is pretty rich with women in EMS. So, just one of our neighboring EMS systems has another EMS medical director and associate medical director that are both female, and both people that I've reached out to over the last couple of years. But also too, we've had a lot of males within the role and within our own emergency department that are very supportive of females. And I can't speak enough to that. Yes, we have excellent female role models, and I can, probably my top 3 mentors going through residency were female, but we also have very supportive, just faculty in general. And it was like, you want to pursue EMS? Great. How do we get you to it? How do we get you to the right people? Who's going to mentor you? Who wants to mentor you? And there's no shortage of that. And I actually have an EMS background. So working as an EMT and a medic before I went to med school. And yeah, it was definitely male dominated, but there were still a lot of females that I worked with and trained with. So it never really became an issue, or I never really thought of it as an issue, and kind of, you just go into the firehouses now and it's like, okay, there's more men than women, but not a big deal. So it could turn at any time. I mean, if you look 5 years ago or 5-6 years ago at Christ, the EMS department was pretty much all male, and now it's all female. But I mean, it just incredibly supportive faculty at Christ in general.
Jenna, any last thoughts?
No, I just echo everything that they said. From a mentorship standpoint, of course, Jess and Liz were both great mentors to me, and they've been powerhouses in disaster and EMS, and I just want to join the crew.
We needed the third.
The triumvirate. I'm going to ask one last specific question, and then we'll pivot to the wind down here a little bit, which is one of our students from a different area of the country was saying on our website, we talk about the high number of level 1 traumas. And so, it's somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000, which is, one of the busiest trauma centers in the country. What do we mean when we say a level 1 trauma in Chicago? And so they said at our institution, any car accident counts as a trauma. What constitutes a level 1 at Christ to get you into that category? I don't know the answer to that, so I'm gonna ask you guys.
Essentially a trauma with unstable vitals. I mean, everybody had, so each EMS system could define a level 1 or level 2 or level 3 trauma based on kind of their area and what their normal volume is, right? Like, I think something like 75 or 80% of our trauma is penetrating. That's not going to happen in other counties or in other areas. So like their definition of what might be a level 1 or a level 2 might be different depending on where you go. Consistently, we're right up with Cook County every year in terms of the highest number of trauma activations. When we say level 1 at our institution, we essentially mean some kind of blunt or penetrating trauma that has produced either an altered level of consciousness or unstable vitals. Not just somebody that got into a car accident. That's not a level 1 trauma. They've got to have something else going on with them. And I'll pivot. I think that's probably the easiest way to summarize it, but I'll open it up to Jess.
There'd be like certain areas of the body where there's penetrating trauma that would automatically, like penetrating trauma to the neck or the chest or the torso, like typically those would be a level 1 trauma as well. But yeah, just a plain blunt trauma motor vehicle accident doesn't count. It'd have to be some other, and there's different ways we separate that out. I mean, there's a vital sign component and there's like an anatomic component, that kind of make that determination, but sick people get made traumas essentially.
When people ask me that,
right, to the point where it's like somebody fell down 15 stairs. Are they mentating okay? Yeah. Do they have open wounds? Yeah. It's like, that's not a level 1.
Put them in the hallway.
But we'll see them in the hallway,
But when people ask me that in interviews, I always say basically just think of really sick traumas. That 4,000 to 5,000 number is really sick traumas. So
yeah, it should really be probably 4,000 to 5,000 trauma resuscitations would be accurate.
when you're comparing those numbers, we also at Christ only count patients that we do the initial eval and recess, whereas some people count transfers into their institution. So,
Right, yeah, we don't count those.
I'll do the wind down here. We've got just a couple minutes. Last week, nobody had trained at Christ. This week, all of you guys had trained at Christ. And so our theme for the season is sort of what we call the ACMC difference, or what's so unique about training at our institution. And so for them, it was working as attendings. For you guys, you can reflect more having trained there as well. And so I'll just go down the line and ask kind of what's your favorite thing about training at Christ or working at Christ now as an attending? Jenna, we'll start with you.
Oh, my, if you pick one, I get more than one. I'll get two. One, the patient population. So our acuity and our volumes are just like unparalleled to other places, I believe. And I grew up in this community. So the people that are coming through that department are my family members, sometimes literally, but also just the people that I grew up with in this community. And the volumes that we see in the acuity are just amazing. So it's a phenomenal place to train. And then secondly, the people that we train with just really make the place what it is. So much so that I didn't want to leave, and I'm really happy to be staying there. And then just to see the support that you've been given all throughout residency, from the day that you walk in there until the day that you leave, it's just been nothing but support. Those are my two favorite things.
Liz, we'll do you next.
I'll echo what Jenna was saying about our patient population. It's very diverse. I liked how I felt the easiest way to summarize it is I felt like at Christ I could be a true ER physician as they were meant to be working, right? You can go to a lot of ERs where they consult general surgery, to put a line in. They consult anesthesia to intubate someone. They consult all these people. And so really it's just like a holding area for like the next step in their care. But here we are practicing at a tertiary care center, a trauma center, and we've got our hands in everything, right? We can do trauma resuscitations. We do adults, we do peds. We get, one of the things I was surprised was, we do a lot of ortho, we do a lot of pharmacy, all of those things that I thought kind of were truly in the wheelhouse of an ER provider. And I wasn't really hearing that happen at other locations, especially a lot of other programs. But then, moving onward, looking at other jobs as an attending, really just weren't available. So I felt like this was still going to hone my skills and continue to train me and surprise me every day. Something new is walking in every day. I mean, 2 days ago, I had a STEMI who was a hemophiliac. I was like, I've never encountered this. What do I do? Let me think about it, and just kind of, getting that wide variety of patients. And then also too, it's just such a supportive environment once you come in and kind of get your mentors and your friends and your colleagues. And it's such a collegial group that I don't really see that at a lot of other institutions. And as an attending, being able to say like, hey, can you cover my shift? And you've got 10 people being like, yeah, what's up? What's wrong? Like, can I help you in any way? Just having that supportive environment, I really haven't seen anywhere else. So, I mean, those are the two biggest things, the patients and the people that I work with.
Jess, we'll let you go last. And you were obviously gone for a bit, so it'd be nice to hear your perspective.
So I think it is a little unique perspective. So I worked in 4 community hospitals with a Democratic group. So it was a wholly different thing. So not academic medicine at all. And I think coming back with that one, you realize how well you're trained, like you do know how to deal with anything really. But I think coming back, I mean, Christ is unique and everyone really wants to support each other. They want to help each other and they want to make each other better. And that goes from an intern on your first day to attendings who've been there for 30 years. I think that everyone is trying to make each other better. And I think that's from an attending standpoint, it's a cool environment to be in because you're constantly pushed to kind of just stay up and stay good, right? And I think that also makes for creating really solid emergency medicine physicians coming out of there. So.
Agreed.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna wind down here and let everybody go. We'll try and be respectful of time. If anybody's got questions that weren't answered, they can feel free to shoot me an email. I'll get it along to one of the panelists to get back to you. But we appreciate everybody's time. Thank you.